2009's Need for Speed Shift wasn't the first in the series to set itself primarily in a closed legal environment, but it was the first to aim more directly to an audience who mostly buy these games, which given the sales numbers, that's a lot of people. And this one in comparison was pretty solid, combining both worlds of simulation and arcade together with a dramatic interior view, expanding the number of different ways to play this game. But then again, anything was going to be better than Need for Speed Undercover. During this period, this was an experimental title amongst other Need for Speed games being made at a rate it probably shouldn't have, with at least 2 being released for 3 straight years. And the one intended for a Q1 2011 release was rumored to be a sequel to Shift, especially after former Slightly Mad studio programmer Chris McClure, who left them a few months later, claimed that Need for Speed Shift 2 was one of the games he worked on during his time there, and was eventually confirmed by EA in November. According to multiple developers of Slightly Mad Studios, the first Shift was never intended to be a case of waiting for the sales numbers to come in before greenlighting a sequel, but a grand plan to separate itself into its own spin-off series, like a supporting character in a movie branching out on their own. So while Need for Speed titles were maintaining their arcade prowess, with Hot Pursuit in particular focusing more closely on its 1990s roots, Slightly Mad Studios wanted their follow-up to go deeper into the sim genre while still maintaining their focus on providing the feeling of being out there on the track. And it reflected in the game's title when not Need for Speed Shift 2 Unleashed, but Shift 2 Unleashed was released for the PC, Xbox, PlayStation 3 and mobile on its intended month of March 2011. Unlike its predecessor before this review, I've never played this game before. In fact, this and The Run are the newest games of the series I've played to this point. Kinda shocking coming from someone who's also reviewed a majority of the series, right? But like I've said numerous times, my interest in new Need for Speed games was pretty much dead by the 2010s, and when I'm not interested, I won't buy or play it. But I did enjoy the predecessor back when it was new, so maybe this one isn't too bad either.
The power and speed playing you in the seat. It's the best feeling on earth. I'm Vaughn Gittin Jr., Formula D champion.
The first thing you do is a tutorial run with a Nissan GTR on Suzuka East, similar to how the predecessor begins, then buy first car and climb up a more simplistic career ladder where the top is the FIA GT1 World Championship, now known this year as the GT World Challenge Europe Sprint Cup. Given how many times it's changed its name over the last decade, I wouldn't be surprised if it's called the GT We've Run Out of Names Cup the next year. Anyway, that's one of the more recognizable features of Shift 2, that the game is officially licensed by the FIA for GT groups. It includes a couple of these events as well as appearances from real-life drivers based on their race specialty, including Darren McNamara, Chris Rideau, Mad Mike Waday, Jamie Campbell-Walter, and for pretty much the whole game, Formula D champion Vaughn Gittin, all of whom assist you throughout the career, teaching you how to drive and explain how most events work.
Basically, to earn XP, you want to fight hard, drive fast, and win as much as you can.
They're okay. It also adds a little bit of live action to add to the style this game is going for, but they're mostly there just for presentation's sake. And for a brief period, I wanted to give Gittin the Kimi Raikkonen treatment because early on he talked too often on the radio.
Alright, try to find a good rhythm through the S's.
Like, leave me alone, I know what I'm doing. But all of that aside, it's the same career mode as the first game, including events, race, hot lap, time attack, drift, and a leveling system that increases from experience points you earn from these events, which unlocks an extra branch, customization options, extra cash, and every race has bonus objectives to increase it further. But because it's a lot more focused on precision over aggression this time round, there are a few noticeable little differences. For example, the on-track objectives are all the same for every single race, which include perform a clean lap, beat a target lap time, stay in the lead for at least one full lap, master all the corners, and stay on the racing line, which also fixes the inconsistency with the effort required to meet those objectives from the first shift, and the events themselves have been altered slightly to feel less tedious. The drift event, for example, you only need to perform one heat in a couple of laps as opposed to 3. Eliminations are time-based instead of lap-based, which actually feels quite intense, and the overall level of content has significantly increased. Not only are there more events to compete in, but more circuits all over the world day and night, including Mount Panorama, Dubai, Dijon, Brno, Hockenheimring, Suzuka, Catalunya. A lot lot of FIA grade certified ones, presumably thanks to the organization's license, as well as fictional ones in Miami, Shanghai, Monaco, and all the returning ones from the predecessor. And if that isn't enough, if you get the Legends pack, you get old school versions of some of these circuits, including the Hockenheim ring that's over 4 miles long. I honestly don't understand why other games don't do that. In fact, with the total number of environments at 36 excluding variations, that's more than Gran Turismo 5 and Forza Motorsport 4, and even on the 360 it doesn't require a second install disc to get everything. You gotta give credit where credit is due. There are a lot of tracks to race on, and it certainly helps in increasing the variety since they're all spread in different countries and continents, although I felt like Miami and Shanghai were used too many times in the early stages of the game.
We won! Good job, man! Nice drive!
There are also a lot more cars to drive as well, with almost every type you'd expect to see on a tarmac circuit, with extra emphasis on retro models with their own events, which I like the most actually. Some events provide a loaner car to drive, and reaching certain levels and winning events earn you prize models. The only downside is that the engine noises sound very poor. Like most of these cars sound exactly the same, including the predecessor, which eventually drones on after long stretches of gameplay. With over 140 cars in this game, more than double what the first shift had, it's still nowhere near as many compared to its main rivals, but if you heard what Andy Tudor said before the game was released, he wasn't bothered by this at all. In fact, he criticized the kilo number of cars in Gran Turismo 5, putting quantity over quality, comparing it to stamp collecting. Now, okay, he got plenty of flack for saying this considering the GT franchise is established enough that it didn't have too much to prove. A lot of players, including myself, love that sort of thing. That's the point of simulators, to simulate how all cars drive in real life. I mean, not all of them are going to be 100% accurate, but it's very close for such a high volume of cars in one game. And developers of the Forza titles wear that stamp collecting gameplay with a badge of honor, and design the career modes in a way that it's fun to collect cars, that you win a prize model almost every race, and there are no licenses to obtain, just driving and climbing the ladder to win or buy your dream car, because everyone has a different one, with some games having them readily available. Maybe Andy was just criticized for making that kind of thing appear not fun, ruining the perception of some players, which is something you gotta be careful with when you review older games actually. But to be fair, even I pointed it out in my Gran Turismo reviews. There are some cars on that list that make you go, why did they even bother? And in the 5th game, under a third of the 1000 were designed for that game, with the rest just upscaled from Gran Turismo 4. The developers also discovered that the average player in the first Need for Speed Shift only had 10 to 15 cars in the garage, only buying what they needed based on tier, nationality, drift, etc. Although that could be contributed to the way the events are categorized, and because it's a Need for Speed game, we're also more accustomed to using the same car for a long time, spending most of it trying to upgrade and customize them, and the developer's intention has always been, make sure that every car can go from something you typically see driving through town every day to a racing monster. So of course, like Need for Speed, customization is always going to be one of the most important aspects. Or is it? Well, performance-wise, it feels a little more complicated at first since there's a bit more menu shuffling compared to the first shift. That one was a case of install a level set of engine, transmission, tires. Here you're purchasing parts individually. Otherwise, it works the same way. When you install an upgrade, it affects the performance. Even a body kit increases the weight, therefore reduces performance, but weight reductions can fix it, etc. And if you're interested in tuning, you can do it all from the pause menu, which is less time consuming. However, like Forza Motorsport, cars are now categorized by their performance numbers, so if you continue to install upgrades, eventually the tier letter is increased. Unfortunately, visually, while they did fix what was by far the worst thing about the predecessor, seriously, there was no way to copy all the work you've done on one side and paste it to the other, which meant you had to recreate it all from scratch on the other side. Seriously, I'm not making that up. It's the only issue they fixed because it's still nowhere near as user-friendly as it should be. You can't move around the car fully. Every time you're selecting a decal, you gotta scroll through one at a time. There's no copy or paste option. None of the sponsor decals decals can be colored. I mean, what if I want to match it with the livery I'm trying to design? And if you scale it to make it appear like a major sponsor, it's all pixelated. The developers just don't understand the concept of shortcuts, at least like the first shift. There are a lot of pre-made vinyl sets with as much as 10 on one car, including some that were used in real life, particularly with the retro models, which all look really nice. But you can tell the customization aspect was no longer a priority in a Need for Speed game anymore. I designed this one and that was it, because I couldn't be bothered to do another one after that, because of how tedious it is compared to something like Forza Motorsport. But also like the predecessor, what matters most is how the game makes you feel when you're behind the wheel in the middle of a race. And this game maintains its focus with, as Andy calls it, emotional simulation that makes it feel rawer compared to Forza Motorsport and Gran Turismo. And you can tell the developers enjoyed designing this part the most. Everything that made the driving experience in the predecessor so dramatic hasn't slowed down at all. Shaky wheel, HUD, head tilting around, see yourself change gear. You can see the driver's reflection, collisions blur your vision. It's all there, but in this game that's not the end of it. There's rubber just outside the racing line, bugs splatting onto the windscreen even if you have the exterior view selected, the driver's fingers have proper animation. Graphically it looks sharper, but that might have to do with me playing this on the Xbox 360 in 1080p, but again, it's one of the best looking interior views for a racing game of that generation. But the two biggest standouts in this game are the night racing, which this game loves to remind you of every chance it gets. It isn't as distracting as I initially feared, though the tracks could have had better lighting, but that's most likely a design choice supposedly inspired by Resident Evil and Silent Hill. And the other standout is an additional camera view that's inside the helmet, similar to riding a motorbike in Grand Theft Auto 4, begging for a VR mod. As you enter a corner, it slightly tilts beforehand, amping up the authenticity almost to a fault. Yeah, I have mixed feelings about this view. Now, looking ahead before a corner is something you do in real life instinctively, and it's good for knowing when to corner without a virtual racing line. But because it had never been done properly before at the time, I've never been able to get the hang of it either. And by the time I completed 30% of the career mode, I just stopped using the helmet cam altogether. What I really hate about it is how much it messes with your head. It fools you into thinking you're driving straight, but you're actually going off the track. It's like the right analog stick is broken on the controller and it's moving all over the place because you don't have full control over it. Do you know which game would benefit the most from this view? Burnout. Just imagine being inside the helmet of a driver if you crash. Anyway, I still prefer the interior view without the helmet because I can at least choose when to tilt my eyes going into the corner, and it's easier to know where the car is pointing. But even in general, with the virtual racing line left on, medium difficulty and high traction control, keeping a car on the track can be tricky, and this was the consensus for both these games despite positive reviews. There were plenty of complaints with the way cars handle. Now the reason it didn't bother me so much is because this game was the first racer I got when I bought a PlayStation 3 in 2009, so there wasn't much else for me to play. I was just glad to have my own 7th gen console and persevered. But now that I've played a lot more racing games of that generation, playing a few of these together with a similar car and racetrack, I can understand where they're coming from. The steering feels more delayed, like you're understeering more than you might think, and you have to keep making constant adjustments even on a long straight, so it's not just the helmet cam, that only makes it even more difficult. And in drift events, if you lose the groove in the second half of the event, you just go into a 180 every single corner until it's over, presumably because the tires are cooked at that point. And on top of all that, opponents are just as aggressive as the predecessor, sometimes to the point they just forget you're on the track. But because the controls are more precision focused, it always seems like every time you make contact, you just slide out so you can't use aggression to compensate. No more of what you saw in the trailer of the first game. And did I mention there's no flashback rewind system? Though that would have made the game too easy. The thing is though, if I'm mastering more corners and the road surfaces are less bumpy, at least compared to a track like Ambush Canyon or Silverstone, it must have been improved in some way, and for the most part it comes down to the car you're driving. Honestly, from my perspective, it controls controls the same way as its predecessor, except there's no aggression badge to earn, so it's not for everyone. I think the biggest problem is the game's confusing direction that took me a long time to figure out. The developers intended on making Shift its own spin-off series of simulation racing games part of the Need for Speed franchise. But to make sure they didn't stray too far from being a Need for Speed game, they kept things all dramatic, maintaining its focus on emotional simulation, and less on cars being 100% accurate to their real-life counterpart. Basically, it has an arcade presentation. Fine, but with Shift 2 Unleashed, the driving mechanics are a little more sim-based, but maintains its industrial, cinematic, in-your-face style, which don't fit together. So what you're left with is a balance between what sim racing fans perceive as not being authentic enough, and casual players will be turned off by the way cars handle, like it doesn't know who its target audience is. Whereas the first Shift was clearly a combination of sim arcade in mind, and generated plenty of advantages between both subgenres in one game. Really, what they should have done with Shift 2 Unleashed is embraced having the choice between precision and aggression. It's crazy how suddenly you're more likely to slide out in contact. It can change the perception of this game so much. Because when you look at this game, all things considered, it is a slight improvement from the first Shift. It has more than twice as many events, tracks, cars, more details put into the interior view, and even night racing is a welcome addition. But the driving mechanics aren't going to be everyone's cup of tea, and I definitely rate their intended rivals ahead of Shift 2. They're easier to get into, the graphics look amazing on their respective consoles, and I still love the concept of being able to drive lots of different cars. There's a reason why these games sell well. Slightly Mad Studios were in a position where they were never going to impress everybody. Like if it leaned even further towards the sim route than it already did, it would have been seen as too unoriginal with the Need for Speed name written in crayon to help its chances commercially. Like, can you imagine a Need for Speed title that looked like this? And it also would have been pointless to be more arcade style because that's what the other Need for Speed games are for. Furthermore, it's published by Electronic Arts, so it was always going to be the unpopular choice. It might have been interesting to see what direction Shift 3 would have gone. Maybe they planned on removing the Need for Speed brand entirely, but I guess we won't know anytime soon. Because even after a decade later, Shift 2 Unleashed was the last in the series to explore the racetrack, before EA cut back to releasing just one game a year again with different developers, and eventually one every 2 years with the same one. Meanwhile, Slightly Mad Studios would go on their own to successfully crowdfund a new series called Project Cars, which has endured a little more success on the next generation of consoles, so it worked out for both sides in the end, even if Need for Speed currently isn't anywhere near its glory years. As for Shift 2 Unleashed, it's only an improvement if you can cope with the controls. So take this review and decide for yourself whether it's worth trying to cope or not. It's a case of choosing between one or the other, but not both.
Wow, you really showed them out there. That's P1, we're the winners.